Hello, and welcome back to the Dreamscape of history. You have found your quiet place again, a place to settle in and to let the world simply fade away. There is nothing you need to do, nowhere you need to be. Just allow yourself to drift on the sound of my voice. Tonight, our journey begins in a city of marble, a city of power, a city that feels eternal. We are drifting back to ancient Rome. When we picture Rome, we see the grand columns of the Forum, white and perfect against a blue sky. We see the legions, the senators in their white togas, the power of a civilization that built the world. But beneath this dream of marble was another reality, a city of 1 million people, loud and crowded and chaotic. A city where life was vibrant, but also incredibly fragile. For all its glory, for all its engineering and its laws, Rome was a place where death could come in the most mundane, the most baffling, and the most strange of ways. So let's drift now into that other Rome. Not the Rome of grand battles, but the Rome of the back alleys, the kitchens, and the doctor's rooms. Our journey begins with something simple, something sweet, a silent, sweet killer that was present at every Roman banquet. The Romans had a love for sweet things, but they had no sugar. Instead, they had a special, beloved ingredient. They called it sapa. To make it, they would take grape juice, unfermented and fresh, and they would boil it down and down, simmering it for hours until it became a thick, sweet, lovely syrup. But it was the way they boiled it that was the problem. They simmered this sweet syrup in pots and kettles made of lead. The slow, simmering acid of the grapes would leach the lead from the pot and into the syrup. The lead itself has a sweet, sugary taste, so this process didn't ruin the syrup. It made it taste even sweeter. This sweet, poisoned syrup, this sapa, was everywhere. They used it to sweeten their wine, which was often too bitter to drink on its own. They used it to preserve fruit, to glaze meats, to create delicate sauces for their lavish banquets. The rich, the poor, everyone consumed it. And the syrup was only the beginning. The Romans were master engineers. They built the aqueducts, wonders of the world, that carried fresh water for miles into the heart of the city. But once the water reached the city, it was channeled into a vast, complex network of pipes. Pipes made of lead. The Roman word for lead is plumbum. It is the root of our own word, plumbing. And so, with every sip of water from a city fountain, with every cup of sweetened wine, with every rich and savory meal, the Romans were drinking in their own slow, strange death. They had no name for what came next. It was not a sudden end. It was a slow, creeping confusion. They called it Saturnine madness, after the god Saturn, who was associated with the heavy, dull metal. It was a sickness of the mind, a deep melancholy, a slowness of thought, a sudden violent anger. It was a strange stiffness in the joints, a pallor to the skin, a sickness in the gut. Historians today look back at the strange, erratic behavior of so many of the Roman emperors, Caligula, Nero, and they wonder. They wonder if the madness that helped to topple an empire was not born of ambition or power, but if it was born in the kitchen. A strange, slow, and quiet end delivered by the very genius that built Rome itself. A death by sweetness. If the poison in the cup did not find you, perhaps the city itself would. The Rome of our dreams is all marble villas and wide-open forums. But the real Rome, for the common person, was a city of towers. They were called insulae, islands. Towering apartment blocks, 6, 7, 8 stories high, built of cheap wood and crumbling brick and pressed mud. They leaned on each other, casting the narrow, winding streets into permanent shadow. And in these towers, 1 million people lived their lives. And in these towers, death was a constant, mundane neighbor. The first and most common fear was fire. In every tiny, cramped apartment, a family cooked their meals and warmed their hands over an open charcoal fire, a brazier. There was no central heating, no chimneys, just an open flame in a wooden room, surrounded by wooden walls in a building of dry, cracking wood. A knocked-over brazier, a stray spark on a windy night, was all it took. The fire would leap from one insula to the next, faster than a man could run. These fires were constant. They would consume entire neighborhoods in a matter of hours. For those trapped on the upper floors, there was no escape. And if the fire did not take the building itself might simply give up. The construction was, famously, shoddy. Landlords built high and fast and cheap to maximize their rent. The walls would crack, the foundations would settle in the mud, the buildings would lean and groan, until one day, with no warning at all, one would simply collapse. A strange, sudden end, buried in the rubble of your own home. But perhaps the strangest peril of the city was the one from above. The streets of Rome were dark. There were no streetlights. Walking at night was a journey into pitch blackness, a narrow canyon of stone and wood. And from the windows high above, the city disposed of its refuse. Romans were not delicate about this. They would simply toss their garbage out the window and into the street below. This included broken pottery, food scraps, and, most notoriously, the contents of their chamber pots. It was such a common and dangerous occurrence that the Romans created a specific law for it, the Actio de Effusis vel degiectis. It was a lawsuit that allowed a citizen to sue the resident of an upper-story apartment if they were struck and injured by something thrown or poured. Imagine that, a citizen hurrying home in the dark. Perhaps they are clutching their toga against the night chill. They are listening for footsteps in the alley, worried about muggers. And in that moment, their end does not come from a knife or a soldier or a poison. It comes from a falling piece of pottery or a heavy tile, slipped from a roof 8 stories above. A sudden, strange, and utterly mundane death in the dark from above. But not all death in Rome was an accident. The Romans, for all their noise and chaos, were a people of deep and rigid tradition. They were built on the idea of the family. The pater familias, the father of the family, held the power of life and death over his entire household. To the Romans, there was one crime that was so unnatural, so vile, so unthinkable, that it struck at the very heart of their world. The crime was parricidium, the killing of one's own parent. For this one specific crime, the Romans developed a punishment so strange, so full of dark, quiet ritual that it is unlike any other. They called it pona culiae, the punishment of the sack. When a person was convicted of this crime, the ritual would begin. First, their head was covered, blinded. They were not to see the Roman sky again. Then their feet were bound, not in leather sandals, but in soli lignea, shoes of wood, heavy, clunky, separating them from the Roman earth. They were beaten, and then they were taken to a place near water. And here the strangest part of the ritual would take place. They brought out 4 animals, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey. Historians have long and calmly debated what these animals meant. Some believed they were symbols. The dog, a symbol of a violated home. The rooster, a symbol of a broken morning. The viper, the poison of the act. The monkey, a dark, twisted caricature of a human being. Other historians believed the animals had no meaning at all, that they were chosen simply because they were strange, and when trapped together would become agitated and violent. The condemned person was placed into a large sack made of oxhide, a heavy leather bag, and then the 4 animals were placed into the sack with them. The bag was sewn shut tightly, and in the quiet of the morning or the dusk, the sack was carried to a nearby river or the sea, and it was thrown into the water. There was no glory in this, no crowd. It was a silent, strange, and cold end, designed to erase the person, not just from the world of the living, but from the world of nature itself. A final, dark dream shared with 4 strange companions. We drift now away from the marble halls of Rome and into the shadowed, bustling streets of the medieval world, a time of castles and cathedrals, but also a time when life was often short and brutal, a time when health was a matter of prayer and chance, and a man with a razor. This man was the barber surgeon, the fellow who would cut your hair, trim your beard, and, if needed, amputate your leg. To them, health was still a matter of humors, of balance. Too much blood, too much yellow bile, you were out of whack. and the simplest and most common solution was bloodletting. You might be given a small cut, or perhaps a simpler method: leeches, fat, hungry leeches, placed gently onto your skin to draw out the bad blood. Their tools were simple, brutal: saws, not clean, sterilized saws, but heavy, crude, often rusty saws for bone, crude knives for flesh, and hot pokers for stopping the bleeding, to cauterize, to burn the wound closed. Imagine the scene: a darkened room, the patient awake, the barber surgeon preparing his tools, the smell of wood smoke, and something else: the fear. We turn now to a different kind of pain, the pain of battle. The Middle Ages were a time of constant warfare. Knights and soldiers knew well the terror of a spear, a sword, an arrow. And for their wounds, there were specialists. They, too, were surgeons. To understand what they faced, we look to a diagram: the wound man, a quiet, clinical record of all the ways a human body could be broken. Arrows, knives, blunt force, boiling oil, each wound meticulously labeled, each with its own terrifying prognosis. The first rule of treating a major wound was to stop the bleeding, and here the hot iron returned. Cauterization, the sealing of the wound with fire, an agonizing but often life-saving procedure. After the fire came the salves, the potions, made from all manner of ingredients: herbs, mold, wine, and sometimes less savory things: animal dung, for example, applied directly to the open wound. There was no understanding of germs, of infection. The goal was simply to close the wound, to draw out the bad humors. The healing was left to God and to chance. We end our tour of medieval surgery with a final, quiet horror, a common ailment that afflicted many: the bladder stone, a hard, crystalline lump that grew inside the body, causing unimaginable pain. For this, there was a specialized surgeon, not a barber surgeon. These were men who traveled from town to town performing this one terrifying procedure. They were called stone cutters. The procedure was called lithotomy, and it was performed without anesthetic. The patient was awake, fully aware. The patient would be tied down, often to a chair or a specially designed table. Their legs would be pulled back and tied firmly. The surgeon would make a deep incision between the anus and the scrotum, cutting directly to the bladder. Once the bladder was exposed, the stone cutter would use special instruments to grasp the stone and pull it out. A brutal, violent extraction. A screaming patient. The wound was then stitched, crudely, with no understanding of hygiene. Infection was almost guaranteed. Many died from the procedure itself, or from the infection that followed. But for those who survived, the pain was gone. A life-saving but horrifying ordeal. The sound of their screams fading into the quiet of history. We are drifting again. Let the dark, damp stone of the Middle Ages dissolve. Let the smell of wood smoke and iron fade away. Our dreamscape moves forward in time. We are moving into a new world, a world of iron and steam, a world of invention, of progress, of towering cities lit by the soft, steady glow of gaslight. We have drifted into the Victorian era, the 1800s, a time of great certainty, of manners, of industry, a time of discovery. But like all times, the Victorian age had its own shadows, its own strange and quiet dangers. They were not dangers from a foreign battlefield or an ancient plague. They were dangers that people invited into their homes. Dangers they wore and ate and drank, all in the name of fashion, of beauty, and of comfort. So let us drift into this world of gaslight and shadows and explore the strange, quiet fads that could kill.
The Victorian ideal of beauty was a very specific and strange thing. It was not the healthy, sun-kissed look of today. The ideal was pale, ethereal, almost translucent. To be beautiful was to look delicate, to look as if you were suffering from a slight consumption, a fragility, a pale, luminous quality to the skin, a faint flush on the cheek, and bright, wide, sparkling eyes. And to achieve this look, this fashionable, fragile appearance, women turned to a very old and very reliable poison: arsenic. It was sold quite openly, in small, discreet boxes, arsenic wafers or arsenic-complexioned pills. They were marketed as a miracle. For clearing the skin, the advertisements would whisper, for brightening the eye, for producing a lovely, clear complexion. And so women, and even some men, would eat it. They would take a tiny, tiny amount of this poison every day, just enough to build up a tolerance. And, in a strange and tragic way, it worked. The arsenic would slowly destroy red blood cells, creating a fashionable, death-like pallor. It would make the skin swell just slightly, stretching it tight, smoothing out any small wrinkles, giving it a waxy, smooth, and luminous look. And it would irritate the eyes, making them water, giving them that wide, bright, sparkling appearance. The cost, of course, was a slow, creeping sickness, a faintness, a subtle rolling nausea, a weakness in the limbs. But for a time, in the drawing rooms of London and Paris, they were beautiful, they were pale, they were perfect.
But the arsenic was not just in the makeup box. It was on the walls. In the 1800s, a new, vibrant, and utterly beautiful color was invented. A green so rich, so deep, so full of life, that it became the single most fashionable color of the age. It was called Shields green, or Paris green, and it was made with a massive, dangerous amount of arsenic. People fell in love with it. They painted their sitting rooms in this glorious, bright green. They papered their nurseries in lovely, whimsical patterns of green vines and flowers. They wore it. Ball gowns of this stunning, vibrant green were the envy of all. But the arsenic did not stay on the walls. In a dry room, the pigment would flake. It would turn to a fine, invisible, poisonous dust that would settle on the furniture, on the teacups, on the children's toys. In a damp room, it was even worse. The wallpaper paste and the damp would cause the arsenic to react, releasing a faint garlic-smelling vapor into the air. People grew sick. Quietly. They complained of headaches, of chronic, draining fatigue, of nausea, of confusion. Doctors were baffled. They blamed the bad air, the nerves, the vapors. They never suspected the beautiful, cheerful green wallpaper in the nursery. Children were the most vulnerable. They would play on the floor, breathing in the dust, and in the most tragic cases, they would simply fade away. A strange, sleepy sickness from which they never woke. A quiet, creeping death delivered by the very walls of their own home. If the poison on the walls was an invisible threat, the poison in the medicine cabinet was an invited guest. The Victorian era was the golden age of the patent medicine. Bottles of dark, thick liquid promising to cure everything. Nerves, coughs, sadness, teething, insomnia. And the most famous, most beloved, and most dangerous ingredient of all was laudanum. Laudanum, a simple, potent mixture. Opium, dissolved in alcohol. It was cheap, it was legal, and it was everywhere. A man with a troubling cough would take a spoonful of laudanum. A woman with female complaints or a feeling of melancholy would take a spoonful of laudanum, and it worked. The pain would fade. The cough would stop. The sadness would be replaced by a warm, drifting, heavy comfort. It was sold under dozens of names: Godfrey's Cordial, Dover's Powder. But the most famous was a small bottle with a picture of a kind, motherly-looking woman, Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup. It was advertised as a miracle for mothers, for children teething. The ads promised it would soothe the child. It would stop the crying. It would give the exhausted mother a night of peace. And just like the laudanum for adults, it worked. A single, tiny spoonful, and the crying baby would become quiet. A second spoonful, and the child would drift off into a deep, heavy, unnatural sleep. Mothers called it the quiet nurse, because Mrs. Winslow's Soothing Syrup was a potent and undeclared mixture of alcohol and pure, raw morphine. And so, across the country, an epidemic of quiet, sleepy tragedy began. Babies who were just fussy were given the syrup, and they would drift into a sleep so deep that they would never wake up. They were called sleeping babies. And the mothers, the women, the men who took it for their own aches and pains and sadness, found themselves in a different kind of trap. A quiet, creeping dependency. They found they could not face the day without their comforting dose. They had invited a cure into their home, but they had welcomed a slow, quiet, and deeply sleepy addiction. A strange, dark comfort from which it was almost impossible to return. Let us drift now from the medicine cabinet to the wardrobe. For the Victorian woman, beauty was not just a pale face or a calm demeanor. It was a shape, a silhouette, an impossibly tiny, wasp-like waist, a full bust, and wide, sweeping hips. And to achieve this shape, this idealized form, they endured a daily ritual of compression, the corset. This was not a gentle, supportive garment. It was an engine of constriction. Made of rigid whalebone or steel and strong, unyielding fabric, it would be laced up from the back, tighter and tighter. This was called tight lacing. Young girls were put into corsets to train their bodies, to force their ribs to grow inward. A fashionable waist was 16 or 17 inches. Imagine that, a waist you could circle with your two hands. And the damage was slow and quiet and profound. The corset would squeeze the internal organs. The liver, the stomach, the intestines were all forced upward or downward, displaced from their natural home. The lower ribs would be bent, and in some cases would crack. Breathing was a shallow, difficult affair. A corseted woman could not take a deep breath. She could only take small, fluttering sips of air. This is why they were so prone to fainting. A sudden shock, a warm room, and there was simply not enough oxygen. It was a strange, slow, self-inflicted suffocation. A life lived in a beautiful, fashionable cage. But the corset was not even the most direct danger in the Victorian wardrobe. There was another, even stranger and faster way to die. The crinoline. To achieve the wide, sweeping hips, women wore a giant, bell-shaped cage under their skirts, a crinoline made of steel hoops or wood. And over this giant, airy cage, they would drape their dresses, dresses made of flammable cotton, of light, airy, flammable gauze. A fashionable woman was a walking bell of dry fabric. And the Victorian world was a world of open flame. Every room had a fireplace. Every hallway was lit by an open, flickering gas lamp. You can see the danger. A woman in her beautiful wide dress would turn. She would misjudge the distance. The edge of her skirt would brush a candle, or a spark would leap from the hearth, and in a single horrifying whoosh, she would be engulfed. She would become a tower of fire. The cage that was meant to give her shape now trapped her inside a furnace. It was a surprisingly common and utterly terrifying end. Thousands of women burned to death. A strange, sudden, and fiery end, all for the sake of a fashionable shape.
So we leave them there, in their beautiful, dangerous world. A world of green, poisonous walls and sweet, sleepy syrups. A world of beautiful dresses that could turn to flame. The Victorian dreamscape was one of progress, of industry, of certainty. But it was also a quiet, strange, and somber place. A place where danger was disguised as beauty. And now it is time to let that dream fade. Let the gaslight dim. Let the sound of the steam engines grow quiet. Let the strange fads of the past simply dissolve. There is nothing you need to do, nothing to worry about. Just the quiet of this room, the comfort of where you are. It is time to let go of these old strange dreams and find your own deep and peaceful sleep. Good night.